Hello, it's Dmitry again. Today I'll be doing another video, hopefully that's a little bit more interesting to me than the material I was working on earlier today. We'll be going back to the Alexander romance, talking about the narrative about the death of Alexander, both in the French tradition, as presented by Jehan Wauquelin and translated by Nigel Bryant, and hopefully I'll get to the Armenian tradition, which is probably resembling the much older Greek tradition that was the language which was originally written. Because the Alexander romance is a very complicated accretional text where we have this original version of it and there's accretions in the different traditions, and so there's stories in one tradition, let's say the Arabic or the Persian tradition, which is completely separate and alien to, let's say, the French tradition, and there's this transition between the earlier pagan traditions to the more Christian or Muslim traditions. There's a lot of diversity to these stories, but a lot of some of the key themes about them, of course, and the original figure we're talking about, Alexander the Great, are obviously preserved, but just transformed into their new, unique context. So I would like to see basically a comparison between this older Armenian tradition and the much later French tradition. So we'll be going into the French tradition first. Again, this is originally from Jehan Wauquelin, which obviously has his older sources that he's referring to. And we'll be referring to initially chapter 87, which is how Alexander sent letters to his mother and to his good master Aristotle. With all the peoples of the world now obeying him, without demur, as their sovereign king and emperor, Alexander promptly dictated letters and sent them to his mother and his master Aristotle, telling them of the battles and trials he'd faced in conquering all the world's kingdoms, and of the strange peoples and creatures he'd found in many distant lands, many distant parts of India and elsewhere. To prove his words, he sent his mother gifts of some of the most amazing discoveries, men with no head, or 1 foot, or 1 eye, and other extraordinary things. And he told her, too, how he'd finally descended on Babylon and triumphantly conquered the city, and was waiting for her there. For his intention was to be crowned there as emperor of the whole world. So he begged her most affectionately to be at his great occasion without fail. For it was his dearest wish that she should share in the celebration and rejoice in his glory. When the lady Olympias received the message and call from her beloved son Alexander, she was joyous beyond measure, and immediately summoned the noble philosopher Aristotle, Alexander's master and teacher, to share the news with him and to seek his help in making the journey possible. But the history says she never made it, as will become clear in the due course. But it does say that Master Aristotle wrote Alexander a letter which read something like this. Chapter 88. The contents of the letter sent by Master Aristotle to Alexander. To Alexander of Macedon, Emperor and King of all earthly kings, the philosopher Aristotle wishes health and joy. Mighty Emperor, I have seen the missives you sent to my lady Olympias, your mother, and to me, which have made plain the phenomenal trials you've suffered in your conquest of the world. In the course of it, your men have shown obedience to you that has earned them a reputation for all worthy qualities. It seems to us, therefore, that you have achieved your goal, lordship of the whole world, that is, by the will of God omnipotent, and the valor of your men. So we give thanks to the God of nature for giving you the heart to learn and retain the knowledge and wisdom that have enabled you to accomplish this. But at the same time, we give thanks to your men for their staunch determination to achieve what has never been seen before and will never be seen again. We pray you be ever mindful of the blood they've shed in order to place you in your high and exalted position, and be sure to repay and reward their service and devotion. It will show the world that their service to you was effort well spent, and will earn you the approval of the great power divine that has no beginning and no end, and may it guide your steps forever. I say all this because in this world it seems there is nothing more contrary to nature than the retention of servants and the rewardings of their service. It's a sin that cries to the high God for vengeance, especially when the shedding of their blood goes unpaid. May Almighty God grant you, wherever you may be, continued honor, joy, happiness, and health. This letter, once written, was taken to Alexander at the city of Babylon, and he received it with delight, and he resolved to follow his good teacher's exhortations, for no advice Aristotle had given him in his life had ever proved to be other than sound. He decided to summon kings, princes, dukes, counts, and barons to a sumptuous feast in his city of Babylon, and in their presence he would make his servants kings, dukes, counts, princes, and great barons of the lands and mighty kingdoms he had conquered. Chapter 89. Of a half-dead child born at this time in the city of Babylon. Our history records that at this time Queen Roxanne, wife of the noble King Alexander, arrived in Babylon and there became pregnant with a child sired by Alexander, late to be named Hercules. But I have yet to find any histories that make much mention of him, only that he and his mother were imprisoned by Cassander in the city of Amphipolis, though they don't specify whether or not he died there. And there's a little note here that says, our history records. It says, Wauquelin has now returned to the prose Alexander as his main source, because he's really referring to more than one source for this. Anyway, let's continue. It wasn't long after Roxanne's arrival that a lady in the city whom Alexander had earlier known carnally gave birth to a child. As soon as he was born, she had him wrapped in sheets and taken to Alexander, bidding him look at what he'd sired. The reason she sent him was the top half of the body, from the head to the navel, was in human shape, but devoid of life. And from the navel down, the body took the form of a throng of beasts, fighting and biting each other monstrously, apparently bent on devouring and destroying one another. Alexander was shocked by the sight of this deformity and began to wonder what it could portend. He suddenly remembered an astrologer in his entourage and sent for him at once. As soon as he arrived, Alexander led him to a chamber in private, just the two of them, and showed him the outlandish child and asked for his opinion. After looking at the deformed creature, the astrologer pondered a little and then sighed deeply and dissolved into tears, weeping bitterly. Alexander demanded that he say what he was thinking and not hold back through fear, and the astrologer with much trepidation began to say, Ah, mighty, glorious emperor, the days are near at hand when fortune will deprive you of all things which she has ennobled and enriched you. Hearing this, Alexander asked him, What is that tells you that, master? I will make it plain, sir, truly, he replied. It is thus. The half of this creature that takes the form of a dead man, separate from the beast, signifies that just as a man is a nobler being than an animal, so you are finer and more noble than any other king now living and any king yet to come. But its being dead is a sign that your death approaches, and the end of your days is near. And the beasts below, biting and clawing at each other, symbolize your barons, dukes, and counts, who compared to you are as good as beasts, and after your death will jealously vie for dominion. Indeed, they're already at odds with one another, but have never dared show it, while you are lord of all the world. But once you're gone, and the world is without a lord, they'll all do battle with each other to win the biggest share, as dogs do over a carcass. That's the meaning of the fighting beasts. Alexander was downcast and dismayed at hearing this, and after ordering the burial of the loathsome creature, he retired to his chamber, where he thought about nothing but his death. Weeping, he said, Dear Lord God, Almighty Father, since I am about to end my days, as several have now informed me, I pray you look upon me with pity, mortal that I am, and bestow such wisdom upon me in my final days, that for the rest of my time all mention of my name shall be to the praise of your infinite majesty. And there's a little note here again on the bottom about 1. It says, by Cassander in the city of Amphipolis. We're talking about where his wife and son Hercules was imprisoned. The note here says Philopame when they're talking about Amphipolis or Amphipolis. Anyway, next chapter. Chapter 90. How Alexander summoned all the great princes in the world to a feast where he intended to be crowned king of all the earth. As you've heard, Alexander was deeply disturbed and troubled in his heart. A feeling sure now that wouldn't be long till the predictions he'd been given by the trees in the Indian deserts and King Calamus's prediction too were fulfilled. As he pondered on this, it struck him that man's only riches after his death are the good name and renown that remains when he's gone, gained by the works he achieved in his life. With this in mind, he proclaimed a most noble feast in the city of Babylon, where he would hold open court amid great splendor and celebration. To it he would summon all his vassal kings, princes, dukes, counts, and barons, bidding them attend in person to make the feast all the finer and more illustrious. And there before the whole assembly he would have them crown him king and lord of all the earth enclosed within the ocean's bounds. And so it was that he dictated letters and sent them at once to all the great princes known to him in the world, commanding them to receipt of the letters, and without any excuse to come to the city of Babylon to attend a glorious feast he wished to celebrate in their presence. Once the messengers were dispatched and news of the feast spread, so many people started arriving from far and wide that, according to the histories, never before or since had such members assembled for a feast as then. It should be added that among the messages sent by Alexander throughout the kingdoms of the world, he sent word to Greece to his mother, the Lady Olympias, informing her of the noble feast that he, her only hope, her beloved son, had proclaimed. His mother was beside herself with joy, seeing her son in a position never witnessed in the world before, and feeling certain in her heart that it would never be seen again. It remains indeed unequal to this day, but she was certain too that among so many people there were bound to be some who didn't love her son, but harbored some resentment of his honor and magnificence. She knew of some who particularly hated him, such as Antipater, lord of Tyre, and his children Cassander and Jobus. So she wrote to Alexander, warning him to beware of treachery, especially from these three, telling him that she knew for sure that Antipater felt no true love for him, whatever he might pretend. Chapter 91. How Alexander sent messengers inviting Antipater to the feast. Antipater was lord of Tyre, a city which we've spoken earlier, and which King Alexander had entrusted to him. According to our history, he was also the guardian of Darfur, a city and territory won by Alexander from Duke Melchus. Our history refers to the victory as taking place after the conquest of Babylon. With all respect, this strikes me as improbable. It should surely rather be placed before the accomplishment of the vows of the peacock. But since we've found it so in our source, we shall give a brief account of it in the following chapters, so that the details of the conquest are at least known, but will return for a moment to the matter in hand and tell how Alexander summoned Antipater to the feast. And so back to the notes here, it says here, talking about Melchus, Alexander from the Duke of Melchus, is referring to, see above, page 73. Okay, so just look at other parts of the book, which I have not read for reference. Not that section anyways. Our history refers to, okay, so that one about the vows of the peacock, that's another section of the book. Wauquelin is referring to the fact that La Prise des Fours, an anonymous 13th century work from some 1,650 lines, is interpolated in some manuscripts of the verse Roman d'Alexandre, including evidently the manuscript from which he was working towards the end of branch 3 after Alexander's conquest of Babylon. So, I mean, that's interesting. Let me continue here. It says here, that's 3. I'll read that next one when it comes up. Now, the reason, we'll get to that when we get to it, I guess. So, part of the reason I want to make a little bit minor commentary on this, basically Jehan Wauquelin is reading from other earlier sources, and he's treating it as basically being totally legit histories, regardless of how fantastical it becomes. And so he's going to have some literary criticism of like, well, clearly this is not, timeline's not lining up with the vows of the peacock, without necessarily realizing that the vows of the peacock was in fact an interpolation from the French tradition in the first place. Seemingly, but whatever. There's no doubt that Alexander was shocked by his mother's letter, but he gave no sign of this to anyone. Our history suggests he didn't quite believe it, mainly because Antipater was a native of Macedon and, as I've said, he had given him the city of Tyre. All the same, to make certain, he dictated a letter requiring Antipater, as soon as he received it, and setting all excuses aside, to come to the feast, for he greatly desired to have him in his company at the coronation he meant to stage in the presence of all the kings and princes of the world. Antipater was alarmed and dismayed by this summons, fearing that Alexander meant to strip him of his authority and bestow it elsewhere. And suddenly the enemy of all goodness entered his body and inspired him to plot the death of Alexander, as you'll hear in due course. But first, we'll explain what prompted him to this. So, that's an interesting way how they phrase that. The enemy of all goodness entered his body, so the devil entered his body and corrupted him. Chapter 92. How the land of Darfur was conquered and Duke Melchus killed at the prompting of Gratian, a knight of Tyre. Our history says, again, this is 3 here, says our history, i.e. the Prise de Darfur section of the Verse Roman d'Alexandre. So anyway, our history says that one day, as he was riding on one of his missions, King Alexander met a knight named Gratian of Tyre. Where he came before the king, he was questioned about what he had brought him there. And he said that he was from the land of Chaldea, from the city of Tyre, or this country thereabouts, and had come in search of support because the lord of the land, whom he had served for a long time, was wicked and craven. His retinue was filled with liars and flatterers, and he paid heed to no one else. Gratian was so persuasive that Alexander mobilized all his forces and followed him to his land, where there stood a mighty city. Here there was a rich duke of great age by the name of Asper. For here, Asper referring to Jasper and Laprise de Darfur. In his edition of Laprise, Lawton P.G. Peckman notes that the names Jasper and Melchus may have been inspired by 2 of the 3 biblical magi. It does sound like that, to be fair. No Balthazar, though. Anyway, King Asper, who had 2 valiant sons, one aged 20 and the other 18. We've frequently spoken of this 20-year-old in the course of our story, for his name was Floridas. That's what makes us feel that his conquest of Darfur is better placed before the vows of the peacock than here. The other son was named Doris. That's Dauris. As soon as Alexander reached the land, its overlord was a powerful duke named Melchus. He began to wage mighty war and seize towns and strongholds until he arrived outside the city of which Asper was lord. Because of this age, however, he had now placed his 2 sons in charge. And when they saw Alexander and the Greeks descending on Chaldea, they assembled all the men they could and launched many a sally and engaged in many a bloody combat and clash with Alexander. And on one such occasion, Floridas' bold valor led to him being captured, and he was taken to Alexander and became his prisoner. And he came to admire Alexander greatly, just as Alexander admired Floridas' manner and courage. I'm sorry, but this is like a huge detour. I'm just saying that right now. I'm thinking that I might just want to skip this section about this sideshow about... No, it's 1 chapter left. Don't worry about it. Okay. Chapter 93. How Duke Melchus was killed, Doris married, and Floridas captured again. When Floridas was taken captive and his brother Doris, seeing how fortune was raising Alexander to the very top of her wheel, swiftly informed his liege lord Duke Melchus, that is, of the disaster that had befallen him. Melchus mustered all his forces as soon as he could, and while they were assembling, he sent an embassy to Alexander to tell him that unless he left his land and returned his liegemen to him, he would attack him in such numbers that he would repent too late. Alexander was unimpressed. Then shortly after Floridas' capture, Doris, in the city and raging at his brother's imprisonment, launched a sortie against the Greeks so effectively that he captured Dancelin, brother of Ptolemy. Even if he wasn't his actual brother, we've always found him to have been his brother in arms, and thereby was able to win back his brother Floridas in exchange. And it wasn't long after the exchange that Duke Melchus arrived outside the city with all his forces. A day was agreed for battle, and the two armies advanced to confront each other. There was terrible slaughter on both sides, in the course of which Duke Melchus was killed, and his whole army routed, you could say. And in this battle, both the aforesaid brothers, Floridas and Doris, were captured, and it said that when they were taken to Alexander, he said they were a prize worth more to him than the 12 times the number of lands he'd conquered. He was then informed that Duke Melchus had a most beautiful daughter. He bade that she be brought to him there at the city of Darfur, and gave her in marriage to the young knight Doris, much to his joy, for he had long loved her, and she him. The conquest complete, Alexander moved on, but to ensure that the land remained safely under his lordship and dominion, he appointed Antipater, of whom we've been speaking, to be its governor on his behalf. And it says here, a little note here as well, talking about before. I don't think it was mentioned, but it says here, in La Prise de Darfur, Alexander was overjoyed to have them in good shape, with neither of them harmed. He relished winning them more than any of the lands he'd conquered. And he said to the men, I have the rose and the lily. I've never seen two braver men of their age. And that he notes that the Floridas is well named because you are Florus, embellished, with a noble heart. Well, that's a very nice compliment. And you know it's not like a gay thing because they're all French, so it's they're keeping it totally hetero. So anyway, they'll say some things that are a little bit flamboyant. You think, okay, what's going on here? And it's like, no, he's French. Don't worry about it. It's fine. Anyway, chapter 94. How Antipater plotted to poison his good master King Alexander. Back at his city of Babylon, Alexander, having received his mother's warning about Antipater, summoned him to the feast as you've heard. And Antipater, suspecting that Alexander meant to strip him of his office, decided to resolve the problem once and for all. To see it, he made his way to a doctor-surgeon and wickedly persuaded him to supply him with a toxic potion designed to make people die after a certain time, as some foul murderers still do. Would that they could be found and dealt with. Then Antipater took the potion and hurriedly passed it to one of his sons, Cassander, telling him to go straight to the city of Babylon and wait for him there, and in the meantime to take good care of what he'd given him, which he did. Antipater soon arrived in the city, and Alexander greeted him warmly, giving no sign of heeding his mother's warning. And indeed, he was always reluctant to believe ill reports of men. He welcomed him, in fact, with the utmost respect, going so far to fate and honor him all the more, as to take his son Cassander into his privy council and household. Ah, you wicked murderer, you foul rogue, Antipater, couldn't you see how your lord was honoring you? How could you bring yourself to commit such a crime? You're like any wretched malcontent. The more they're indulged, the more they bite back. There is some truth to that. Some people resent you when you're a little bit over the top with it. Then one day, not long after, Alexander was asleep in bed, and as he slept, he had a vision of Antipater's son Cassander trying to kill him with a sword. Indeed, he'd already run him through. The shock of it woke the king in alarm, and as he came to, he pondered long upon his dream, and then rose and dressed. Then he summoned his astrologer to speak with him, and recounted his dream and asked him what he made of it. The astrologer replied, Mighty emperor, you may be sure that Cassander is ill-disposed towards you, and he has conceived some deep-seated grudge. And according to our history, on the very day of Alexander's dream, Cassander, on his father's orders, tried to pass the potion on to his brother Jobus, by name, a fine young man who often waited on Alexander at table, cutting his meat, but Jobus refused to take it, for he loved Alexander dearly for the honor he paid him, and Alexander was truly fond of him. Chapter 95. How Jobus took the potion from the hand of his brother Cassander in order to poison Alexander. The king set little store by the astrologer's words. He couldn't believe that Cassander could conceive such hatred towards him as to seek his death, when he treated him and his father and brother with such honor, for it seemed to him, and rightly, that it would lead to their own destruction as surely as his own, if not more so. But Alexander was forgetting the fickleness of fortune. Having taken him to the very top of her wheel, she, ever turning just as she pleases, chose not to keep him in his state of majesty. Perverse and inconstant, never to be trusted, she was bent on dragging him to the depths just as she'd raised him to the heights. She somehow arranged it so that one day, so the histories say, Alexander, for no good reason, in a fit of temper struck Jobus on the head with a stick. Young Jobus was upset and humiliated, for it happened in public, and what angered him all the more was that it was quite unjustified. And as a consequence of this, he sought out his brother and made his peace with him. So the point where he consented to the killing of his lord. Indeed, he took the potion from his brother into his own hand and undertook to carry out the poisoning himself as soon as he saw the chance. This wasn't as soon as he thought, because it was some time before he dared properly to show his face to the king again. But he returned to performing his duties as soon as he could, and if he'd been a good and humble servant before, was even more so now. But it was all a sham, as you're about to hear in detail. Chapter 96. How the noble Alexander was poisoned, from which poison he passed from life to death. You've already heard how Alexander sent letters to every kingdom in the world calling lords to his coronation. When the appointed day came, immense numbers gathered in Babylon, greater than any that had ever assembled for the honoring of a single man. The histories say that they were beyond all counting. It was the 14th day of September, referred to as the 18th of the calends of October, the day on which we Christians celebrate the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, and it's reckoned to have been the year 4900 after the creation of Adam, when all the kings, princes, dukes, counts, barons, and all other lords of their various degrees had arrived and assembled. The noble King Alexander appeared before them and acknowledged them with a most respectful greeting, which they returned in full measure. These honorable salutations, duly exchanged, the highest, most noble of them all, took King Alexander, and crowned him with a golden crown, most precious and magnificent, and seated him on high, on a lofty royal throne. And they crowned him not as one might any other king, but as king, emperor, and conquering lord of all the world, from furthest east to furthest west, from furthest north to furthest south. Then they led him in great pomp and triumph to the temple of Jupiter, where they made sacrifices according to their custom. From there they returned to the royal palace, which had been so sumptuously adorned and bedecked that no mortal man could describe even half the abundant riches on display. The tables were set and laid most lavishly, and the king sat at the very highest in full view of the whole assembly. And truly anyone who beheld him there would surely have rejoiced at his radiant mien. Ah, foul murderers, Jobus, you're like the toad that's choked by the scent of the flowering vine. In the glorious presence of all earthly might, you somehow brought yourself to do what you did, just because of a single blow dealt by your master, your lord, your king, a blow that caused no wound or hurt, and was struck merely to exercise his rage. Did your own rage need to be so great that you, his subject, delivered him up to death? He asked you for a drink, and now and you gave him the last drink he ever drank as a healthy man? Here's how it happened. The king, sitting in glorious state with all the kings, princes, and barons in joyous spirits, wished to join in their revelry and called for the cup from which he always drank, the cup in which Jobus had slipped the poison. Jobus proffered it. The king took it, cup in hand, and he said, "All you noble men here present, I thank you for the honor you have shown me. It is an honor deriving not from myself but from you, and so I drink to you, all to wish you ever greater joy and good cheer." So saying, he raised the cup to his lips and drank. And truly, the moment he drank, he slumped across the right side of his seat, feeling just as if a sword had been thrust through his heart. But for the sake of all his assembled guests, to avoid dampening their spirits, he gave no sign of this till the tables had been cleared. Chapter 97. How King Alexander tried to vomit up the poison, but couldn't. When the tables were cleared and Alexander rose, music and merrymaking began in the hall. Then Alexander came to his barons and said, "Dear friends and companions, celebrate and make merry, I pray you. But excuse me if I don't stay. I need to go and rest a little." And he withdrew at once to a fine chamber, followed by the wicked murderer Jobus, ready to complete his work. As soon as he was inside, Alexander bade Jobus give him a feather to put in his mouth so that he could vomit up something he'd eaten or drunk, which he said was giving him dreadful pain around the heart. Jobus promptly handed him a feather or plume, which was also poisoned, and with a more evil venom than the one he'd drunk. The moment the king placed it in his mouth, he started writhing in greater agony than ever. He was suddenly so hot that he felt his whole body was burning. He didn't know what to do. Then he called for a door to be opened. It overlooked the garden, at the foot which flowed the Euphrates, and soon as the door was opened and the cool air struck him, he was overcome by the heaviest stupor and threw himself on a couch and was asleep in an instant. His wife, Roxanne, and a party of ladies and damsels came to see how he was, and when they found him asleep, they thought he was taking a rest, as he often did for his health's sake. But far from being at rest, it seemed as he slept that he was racked by dreams. He kept making strange signs as a dreaming man will. Alexander stayed like this till midnight, much to his surprise of the kings and princes, who had never known him sleep like this before. Chapter 98. How the king tried to drown himself in the river Euphrates, but was stopped by his wife Roxanne. The lady Roxanne had never seen her husband sleeping so, and was very worried, but didn't want to wake him for fear that it might unnerve him. So she sat beside him with some of her ladies, waiting for him to wake and to see how he was. About midnight he woke and arose from his bed, but with great difficulty, for he couldn't stand upright at all, and had to go on all fours like an animal. So acute were the pains besetting his heart, he was in such agony that he crawled from the chamber and started struggling down to the river that flowed nearby, where it's thought that in his despair he meant to throw himself in and drown, though it might have been just to drink, or to let the water's chill quench the poison that was burning his whole body. If he did intend to be swept away, it may have been that he didn't want his body to be found after his death. I can't think of any other reason, but that's what the histories suggest. His wife, Queen Roxanne, seeing him head for the river and realizing he meant to kill himself, caught him and stopped him. And heavily pregnant as she was, she took him in her arms and, with some of her ladies, wept bitterly and said, "Ah, most noble emperor, what despair makes you want to kill yourself so wretchedly without anyone knowing of your end?" "Truly, lady," Alexander replied, Throughout my life I have done all I can to fill the lives of the good and worthy with joy and glory. So I wanted to end it in secret, so that when my body wasn't found, they'd be less anguished and distressed. Ah, noble emperor, said the queen, you've always toiled and striven to win acclaim and reputation. Now it seems the end of your labor is near. You know that a well-finished work earns praise, so I pray you, mighty emperor, order your affairs before your end, so that the glorious renown you've won at the cost of so much effort, as everyone knows, may live in eternal memory after your death among future generations, and all worthy men may learn from your example and win honor and commendation. Then Alexander, knowing the queen was right, agreed to do as she asked. He returned to his chamber and lay down in bed, and as soon as he'd done so, he called for Jobus, his chamberlain, the one who'd waited on him at table and cut his meat, the one who'd loved so dearly that he would never have guessed it was he who'd put him in this perilous state, and bade him send for his notary, which he duly did. Chapter 99. How King Alexander made his testament according to our history. As soon as Alexander saw his notary Simeon arrive, he bade him sit beside him and write down his testament as he dictated. This he did, and the testament was drawn up as follows. I, Alexander, son of the god Ammon, which is a little note here that says, this is taken directly from the prose Alexander, and of course as odds with Wauquelin's earlier rejection of the idea that the god Ammon was Alexander's father. So let's continue. I, Alexander, son of the god Ammon, and Queen Olympias, king of kings and lord of the earth, wish all who read or hear these words to know that by the will of Almighty God, without which nothing is done in this world, and through the efforts of our men, we have won dominion over all the earth, and been crowned its lord in this great city of Babylon, with all due solemnity and splendor. But fortune, who until the day of our coronation have placed us at the very pinnacle of her wheel, in greater glory and honor than any man before, by making us supreme lord of all, wish to show all who come after us that no one should trust in earthly glory. For it is often the case that a man imagines himself to have hit the heights, and the very next moment he hits rock bottom. So it was that on the very day of our coronation, when I thought my work was done and I could begin to enjoy the rewards of rest, we were fed a poison which we are sure will be our death. And by the very people we had nurtured at our side with all the love we would have shown to our own children. But we don't want fortune boasting that she has brought us down, so we wish all to know that, though nothing in life is more certain than death, and nothing less certain than the hour when it will come, fortune cannot rob us of the fame won through our deeds, the extent of which shall be all the plainer as we now make our testament, bequeathing all the lands and the positions we have won. Firstly, we wish to be buried in the city of Alexandria, which we founded, and we wish our master Aristotle to send the Egyptian priests who serve in the temple where our body shall rest 1,000 gold bezants. This is to say 120,000 pounds. And because we have often in our life considered who might rule Egypt after our death, and found no one in our view fitter for this man than Ptolemy, we wish him to be their lord and governor, and guardian of our body too, that he may better keep our testament in mind. And there's a little note here, I want to read this for you. This is the end of the chapter, so I want to read this for you right now. It says here, the next part says the bezants. It says see note 2 above, page 138. I'm not going to read that for you. The next part, that's about the bezants, by the way, the gold bezants, like little gold coins. Bezants are something you would see in coat of arms. they're little gold. They're usually, I mean, I think they're gold, but in principle. But they're like little circles that are gold that you could put on coats of arms as like one of the things you could do as like a mark. I don't know the terminology of coat of arms off the top of my head right now, but bezants are little gold things, and they're originally based off the Byzantine coins that are gold coins. That's why they're called that. Now, the third note here on the page that says, talking about the pounds, it says 120,000 pounds. That says this is the figure given in the Prose Alexander. Wauquelin's text has the confused 1000 livres ou, XCM. I don't speak French. I really can't tell you what that means. But apparently, Wauquelin had that confused a little bit from the Prose Alexander. So let's continue with chapter 100. How Alexander in his testament made all his servants kings and lords of various lands. It is our further wish and command that if our wife, the Empress Roxanne, gives birth to a male child, he be emperor of all the world, and the Macedonians give him a name of their choosing. If it be a daughter, we give the Macedonians full freedom and liberty to appoint a king as they see most fit. And for her part, let my wife keep all our chattels without hindrance, and in the event that she bear a son, let her keep half of Macedon for her own. We wish the aforesaid Ptolemy to be prince of Egypt, Africa, and Arabia, and all the territories to the east as far as Bactria. And along with his lordship, we give him for his wife the fair Cleopatras, whose marriage to our father Philip we long ago opposed. This is recorded above. Phaeton is to be prince of Greater Syria, and Militernus, prince of Syria Minor. Let Rotas be prince of the kingdom of Sicily, and Philotas, prince of Media and Persia. Sino shall be prince of Sabaean, and Antigonus, Philip's son, shall be prince of Greater Phrygia. Our notary, Simeon, shall be prince of Cappadocia and Paphlagonia. Nartus, prince of Lycia and Pamphylia. Cassander, brother of Philotas, shall be prince of Phrygia Minor, and Meneander, prince of the Isle of Ponto. Philip the Aphrodisian shall be rule the Peloponnese, and Seleucus, whom we call Lecanor, brother of Philotas, shall be the lord of all the castles that belong to King Antiochus. Cassander and Jobus, Antipater's sons, in return for their fine services to us, shall be overlords and governors of all the princes we appoint in distant India. Cassitus shall be prince of the Syries, who dwell between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Fintanagre, or Fintanagre, is to rule Escaloine. Osius shall be prince of Peripomenos as far as the Caucasus Mountains, and Sertimus shall be prince of the Persians. Cteus is to be prince of Urcania. Itocornus of the Persian desert, and his brother Philip of the Urcanians. Ptolemy's brother Clicons, whom we call Dancelin, shall be lord of Babylon, and Antheo, prince of Pelus. The Ethiopians are to be free, and let them appoint a lord of their own choosing, so long as he be worthy. The Gauls likewise shall be free, and make their own king, and let Gratian be lord of Tyre and Darfur. We further wish and decree that all men now in exile be recalled, and all in captivity be set free. And we wish all people of every degree to know this. We are less concerned about having to leave our worldly glory and die a bitter, unworthy death than we are that our lords may be left in the hands of men who will be unwilling to devote their resources to advancing and enhancing the honor of the worthy. There's a lot of notes here in this page. I didn't want to go through each one during it, but the Prose Alexander reads Bactrian, while Wauquelin text reads Bretagne. This was the first of a number of proper names in the passage which evidently caused Vauquelin and the translator of the Historia de Paris some difficulty. I have rendered them differently than the meaning is clear or possible. Otherwise, I have retained the spellings as they appear in the text. So, Bactrian refers probably to maybe Bactria, I would assume. Maybe I'm wrong. Is it referring to lands given over to Ptolemy, which is Ptolemy? It says here, we wish after Ptolemy to be prince of Egypt, Africa, Arabia, and all the territories east as far as Bactria. It says Bactra, probably Bactria. Now, they calls it Bretagne, which is referring to Brittany in France. Obviously, a lot of the stuff we're talking about with France is kind of, what's the term for it? I can't believe I'm blanking on this right now. It's ahistorical, is one way to phrase it. There was no France in during the time of Alexander. There was no Franks living in France. The land was called Gaul, as they refer to in other cases. Gaul was inhabited by Gaulish people, not by the French. And Brittany was not called Brittany. It was called, something. I think Amorica or something like that. And maybe they're just referring to Great Britain. Maybe I don't know. But regardless, Alexander the Great was not hanging around those places. Just for reference. Next one says PP 551. This is referring to a note about, this is recorded above, talking about the marriage between Philip and Cleopatra. But apparently, according to them, Ptolemy marries Cleopatra, which is like the former wife of Philip, what Alexander opposed. Next one is 3, at least attempted marriage. In theory. I don't know how the Alexander romance treats it in this tradition, whether or not they actually got married or not. They did get married, I think, in truth, but whatever. I'm not keen in on that kind of stuff. Felipe Lee Afridian, which his name is often a corruption of Aridius, Alexander's half-brother who became Alexander III. See also below, page 286 and footnote 1. Vauquelin, this is number 4 now. Vauquelin has followed the prose Alexander misreading of Lan's Ceres as Sinis, and writer Villard as Old Man. The Suris were an Indian people who says the Latin text of the Historia de Paris lived between the two rivers Idaspem and Indum. Idaspem and Indum. So basically, some people living in the Far East in basically India, Pakistan, around the Indus River. And those people were somewhere there rather than being with the Euphrates. Following the prose Alexander, this is a misreading of the Phaeton Agenoris Filius Sit Princeps in Colonias in the Historia de Paris, talking about the Phaeton. Where is Phaeton mentioned? Tigris and Euphrates. Phenotagur is to rule Escalonia. I don't know. 6. Almont de Cassasi. Several of the Alexander historians attach the name of the Caucasus to the Hindu Kush, antiquity called Paropamisus. Yeah, I mean, to them, I think the word Hindu Kush, I've heard this before, maybe, I don't know if it's 100% correct, but Hindu Kush comes from the word Hindu Caucasus, like Indian Caucasus. And they believed at the time that the Caucasus Mountains and the Caucasus we think of today, in Georgia, Armenia, and so forth, actually stretched all the way across Central Asia and into basically the north of India. There was like a continuous mountain chain that existed. Make sense? So that's why it's kind of conflated. Anyway, we're going to go into chapter 101 soon. I'm going to take a brief break. Okay, chapter 101. How the Macedonians came to the palace in great agitation to ask Alexander to make Perdiccas their king. While Alexander was dictating his testament, a thunderous storm erupted, so fierce and awesome that it seemed the world was about to end. The whole sky was ablaze with lightning bolts. It seemed the earth would crumble under the force of its monstrous quaking, and men and women were pitching and tumbling over each other in panic. The history says the chaos lasted for the best part of 2 hours. in which time many towers, castles, and forts and houses came crashing down. People started saying it was a sign of King Alexander's death, which is why, as soon as the storm had passed, the Macedonians and Greeks came rushing to the palace, fully armed, in a state of great agitation. And to the attendants' lords they cried aloud, Sirs, sirs, if you don't let us see our prince, our emperor, and King Alexander, we'll slaughter you all right here and now. Alexander, in bed, dictating his testament as we've said, heard the yelling of the Greeks and Macedonians and asked what was going on. Mighty emperor, came the reply, the princes and people from Greece and Macedon are threatening to kill us unless we show them their emperor. When Alexander heard this, he bade them take him to the palace. He was bodily carried there on a couch as he commanded, and when he arrived and saw his people thronging there in such a state, he began to weep most bitterly. And through his tears he called upon them in his eloquent and persuasive way to nurture peace and harmony between each other. Many words were then exchanged, until finally Macedonians appealed to him as one, saying, Great and mighty emperor, since there is no remedy for your sickness, and it seems that you must die, we pray you decide who will rule us when you're gone. Then Alexander answered, Great and valiant Macedonians, my beloved and companions and friends, your king after my death shall be the one you decide yourselves according to your own best judgment. Then they all cried with one voice, Mighty emperor, if it please you, we would have none but Perdiccas. We pray you appoint him our king and governor before you die, as you've appointed many others among us here. At this point Alexander summoned Perdiccas and said to him, My dear friend and companion, before all here present, I bequeath to you the kingdom of Macedon, and appoint you its lord and king, and command to you your care and protection my lady Roxanne, my beloved wife and spouse. Hearing this, the Macedonian princess came to the king, one after another, thanking him and tearfully kissing his hand as if taking their leave. And Perdiccas, weeping and sighing deeply, came to him and said, Ah, great and awesome emperor, the Macedonians, Greeks, and all other nations will find governors aplenty, but truly none to match your goodness and largesse will be found under heaven when you're gone. Chapter 102. How Alexander sat up in bed and gave them words of comfort, and then died. While Perdiccas was speaking, Alexander, seeing all his barons in floods of tears, he had his attendants sit him up in bed so that he could see them properly. Then he summoned his notary, who'd written down his testament, and promptly bade him read aloud in the presence of them all. When it had been read, his barons came to him, one after the other, to kiss his hands, weeping so bitterly that no one who saw them could have failed to feel pity. The common folk were grieving and wailing more than any, which makes me think that if Alexander had been ruthless, proud, and cruel, as some histories claim, he would surely have been no more spoken of or lamented than his father, King Philip of Macedon, who was harsh and cruel indeed. What is beyond all doubt, I think, is that he was beloved of God Omnipotent, when he chose in his glorious might to endow him with so many qualities. So why would his men not weep at his death? And weep they did, that's certain, and so did the animals. And we read in the histories that the death of the mighty Emperor Alexander, the sun withdrew its light from the world as if in an eclipse. Then Alexander, sitting in his bed, seeing the desperate grieving of his barons, and the constant bouts of thunder and darkness, and the feeling death with its bitter pangs pressing him to leave this world, spoke in the Macedonian tongue to say, I feel more grief that so many good men are left in anguish at my death than I do that I must die. Then some of the Macedonians replied through their tears, Ah, gracious emperor, we'd rather die with you than live on after your death. We know the kingdom of Macedon will be unable to resist its enemies once you're gone, but we grieve more for the loss of your valiant heart than for the danger we'll now face. Chapter 103. the year and time when Alexander had passed from life to death, and how he was buried. Amid the terrible grieving and weeping and groaning of all the people of every degree, the noble King Alexander's death throes began. He suffered them for 6 hours. Then he delivered up his soul to his Creator God. So say some accounts, we may at least say his soul was placed at the mercy of the great judge. Alexander's death occurred in the 32nd year after his birth, on the 17th of the calends of October, the 15th day of September, that is, in the year 4900 after the creation. When he was dead and passed away, his men had his body embalmed and prepared for burial with all the splendor befitting his person, dressing him in royal robes and placing his crown upon his head. Then they laid him on a stately carriage and took him to the city of Alexandria, as he had earlier commanded. When they arrived, they sought out all the best, most skillful craftsmen, who made a tomb of such splendor and magnificence that a description would be accounted fanciful, so I'll say no more. But the histories tell us that it stands to this day, and is known by the Greeks and Egyptians as a pyramid. When the tomb was finished and ready, they laid King Alexander's body inside amid bitter weeping and lamentation. And through his tears Ptolemy said, Alas, most noble emperor, dubbed knight at the age of 15, king of Macedon at 20, and in just 12 years the conqueror of all the world, crowned sovereign king of all the earth. What a disaster is your death! Alas, now the world may rightly say it has been orphaned, left without a lord. It seems to me, truly, that the world should end forthwith, for it will never have such a lord again, and no man of such stature will ever be found who could match your achievements, even less by your largesse and courtesy. Alas, death, how did you dare take such a man, especially at the height of his powers, in his prime of life and his pinnacle of wealth? Couldn't you have let him rest a while in his present world rather than strike him down so cruelly at the age of only 32? Such were the anguished words of lament uttered by Ptolemy and the other barons likewise, all beside themselves with grief, and they had an inscription carved upon his tomb that read, Here lies Alexander, king of Macedon. Iron could never vanquish him, but he was put to death by poison in the year 4900 from the world's beginning, on the 17th of the calends of October. And so that is really part of the end of the death narrative. Now, the death narrative section in the book, again, translated by Nigel Bryant, but originally from Jehan Wauquelin, but I don't know if the sections in Jehan Wauquelin's version had the same sort of setup necessarily as Nigel Bryant's. But Bryant's book that I'm reading currently, the death narrative continues, but it really is part of the narrative of the fighting between the lords. And so it's kind of its own little thing that I don't necessarily want to read tonight. I also realize that the video is already about an hour long, and so I have other things I have to kind of do tomorrow and maybe tonight, and so it might be more advisable for me to go read the Armenian tradition tomorrow or some other day and make a comparison between the French tradition, which is a much later tradition, a much later version of the Alexander Romance, and compare it to the Alexander Romance, which is a lot earlier and preserves a lot of the earlier material with less lot less accretions and a lot less, you could say, changes. But anyways, if you like this video, feel free to like and subscribe and do whatever people do on YouTube, I suppose. Leave a comment, hopefully one that's not one that's positive, preferably, right? And have a great rest of your day. Thank you and good night.